I don't remember what chapter I left off on. I should drink some tea. I'm gonna pick up from chapter 4, commitment. Let love be love in me. Commitment is inherent. I need to hold my head up more. Commitment is inherent in any genuine loving relationship. Anyone who is truly connected, truly concerned for spiritual growth of another knows, consciously or instinctively, that he or she can significantly foster growth only through a relationship of constancy. M. Scott Peck. Commitment to truth-telling lays the groundwork for openness and honesty that is the heartbeat of love. When we can see ourselves as we truly are and accept ourselves, we build the necessary foundation for self-love. We have all heard the maxim, if you do not love yourself, you will be unable to love anyone else. It sounds good, yet more often than not, we feel some degree of confusion when we hear this statement. The confusion arises because most people who think they are not lovable have this perception because at some point in their lives, they were socialized to see themselves as unlovable by forces outside of their control. We are not born knowing how to love anyone, either ourselves or somebody else. However, we are born able to respond to care. As we grow, we can give and receive attention, affection, and joy. Whether we learn how to love ourselves and others will depend on the presence of a loving environment. Self-love cannot flourish in isolation. It is no easy task to be self-loving. Simple axioms that make self-love sound easy only make matters worse. It leaves many people wondering why, if it is so easy, they continue to be trapped by feelings of low self-esteem or self-hatred. Using a working definition of love that tells us it is an action we take on behalf of our own or another's spiritual growth provides us with the beginning blueprint for working on the issue of self-love. When we see love as a combination of trust, commitment, care, respect, knowledge, and responsibility, we can work on developing these qualities, or if they are already a part of who we are, we can learn to extend them to ourselves. Many people find it helpful to critically examine the past, particularly childhood, to chart their internalization of messages that they were not worthy, not enough, that they were crazy, stupid, monstrous, and so on. Simply learning how we have acquired feelings of worthlessness rarely enable us to change things. It is usually only one stage in the process. I, like so many other people, have found it useful to examine negative thinking and behavioral patterns learned in childhood, particularly those shaping my sense of self and identity. However, this process alone did not ensure self-recovery. It was not enough. I share this because it is far too easy to stay stuck in simply describing. Telling one story over and over again, which can be a way of holding on to grief about the past or holding on a narrative that places blame on others. While it is important for us to understand the origins of fragile self-esteem, it is also possible to bypass this stage, identifying when and where we receive negative socialization, and still create a foundation for building self-love. Individuals who bypass this stage tend to move on to the next stage, which is actively introducing into our lives constructive life-affirming thought patterns and behaviors. Whether a person remembers the details of being abused is not important. When the consequence of that abuse is a feeling of worthlessness, they can still engage in the process of self-recovery by finding ways to affirm self-worth. The wounded hurt learn self-love by first overcoming low self-esteem. Nathaniel Braden's lengthy work, 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, highlights important dimensions of self-esteem, the practice of living consciously, self-acceptance, self-responsibility, self-assertiveness, living purposefully, and the practice of personal integrity. Living consciously means we think critically about ourselves and the world we live in. We dare ask ourselves the basic questions: who, what, when, where, and why. Answering these questions usually provides us with a level of awareness that enlightens. Braden contends, to live consciously means to seek to be aware of everything that bears on our actions, purpose, values, and goals to the best of our ability. Whatever that ability may be, and to have an accordance with that which we see and know. To live consciously, we have to engage in critical reflection about the world we live in and know intimately. Usually it's through reflection, and individuals who have not accepted themselves make the choice to stop listening to negative voices within and outside the self that constantly reject and devalue them. Affirmation work for anyone striving for self-acceptance. Affirmations work for anyone striving for self-acceptance. Although I had years been interested in therapeutic modes of healing and self-help, affirmations always seemed to be a bit corny. My sister, who was then working as a therapist in the field of chemical dependency, encouraged me to give affirmations to try and see if I would experience any concrete changes in my outlook. I had a realization that I identify with certain as I identify with certain characters. Most of my life I grew up identifying with Superman. Then I identified with Thor. All in an effort to figure out who I identify as myself. Although I had years been interested in therapeutic modes of healing and self-help, affirmations that always seemed a bit corny, my sister, who was always working as a therapist in the field of chemical dependency, encouraged me to give affirmations to try and see if I would experience any concrete changes in my outlook. I wrote affirmations relevant to my daily life and began to repeat them in the morning as it was part of my daily meditations. At the top of my list was the declaration: I'm breaking with old patterns and moving forward with my life. I not only found them to be a tremendous energy boost, a way to kick off the day by accentuating the positive, I also found it useful to repeat them during the day if I felt particularly stressed or was falling into the abyss of negative thinking. Affirmations help restore my emotional equilibrium. Self-acceptance is hard for many of us. There is a voice inside that is constantly judging, first ourselves and then others. That voice enjoys the indulgence of endless negative critique. Because we have learned to believe negativity is more realistic, it appears more real than any positive voice. Once we begin to replace negative thinking with positive thinking, it becomes utterly clear that, far from being realistic, negative thinking is absolutely disenabling. When we are positive, we not only accept and affirm ourselves, we are able to affirm and accept others. The more we accept ourselves, the better prepared we are to take responsibility in all areas of our lives. Commenting on this third pillar of self-esteem, Brandon defines, here's the easy solution, I don't need to see myself. Brandon defines self-responsibility as a willingness to take responsibility for my actions and the attainment of my goals for my life and well-being, end quote. Taking responsibility does not mean that we deny the reality of institutionalized injustice. For example, racism, sexism, and homophobia will all create barriers and create incidents of discrimination. Simply taking responsibility does not mean we can prevent discriminatory acts from happening, but we can choose how we respond to acts of injustice. Taking responsibility means that in the face of barriers, we still have the capacity to invent our lives, to shape our destinies in ways that maximize our well-being. Every day we practice this shape shifting to cope with realities we cannot easily change. Many women are married to men who are unsupportive when they decided to further their educations. Most of these women did not leave the men in their lives. They engaged in constructive strategies of resistance. One woman I spoke with was inhibited because of her husband worked in a plant and she felt uncomfortable having more education than he did. Yet she wanted to re-enter the workforce and needed an advanced degree to do so. She made the choice to take responsibility for her needs and desires, believing it would also enhance the well-being of her family. Returning to work boosted her self-esteem and changed the passive-aggressive rage and depression that had developed a consequence of her isolation and stagnation. Making this decision and finding ways to realize it is not easy to process. However, her husband and children were often disgruntled with her independence, forced them to accept more household responsibility. In the long run, everyone benefited. And it goes without saying that these changes boosted her self-esteem in ways that showed her how self-love made it possible to extend herself in a constructive way to others. She was happier, and so were those around her. In order to make these changes, she had to make use of another vital aspect of self-esteem: self-assertiveness, defined by Brandon as the willingness to stand up for myself, to be who I am openly, to treat myself with respect in all human encounters. Since many of us were shamed in childhood, either in our families of origin or in school settings, a learned pattern of going along with the program and not making a fuss in the course is the course of action we most frequently choose as a way to avoid conflict. As children, conflict was often the settings for put-downs and humiliation, the place where we were shamed. Our attempts at self-assertion failed as an adequate defense. Many of us learned that passivity lessened the possibility of attack. Sexist socialization teaches females that self-assertiveness is a threat to femininity. Along with the faulty logic lays the groundwork for low self-esteem. The fear of being self-assertive usually survives in women who have been trained to be good girls or dutiful daughters. In our childhood home, my brother was never punished for talking back. Asserting his opinion was a positive sign of manhood. When my sisters and I, what is this lag? Oh. When my sisters and I voiced our opinions, we were told by our parenting adults that this was negative and undesirable behavior. We were told, especially by our dad, that female assertion was not feminine. We did not listen to these warnings. Even though ours was a patriarchal household, the fact that females far outnumbered the two males, my dad and my brother, made it safe for us to speak our minds, to talk back. Luckily, by the time we were young adults, the feminist movement had come along and validated that having a voice and being self-assertive was necessary for building self-esteem. One reason women have traditionally gossiped more than men is because gossip has been a social interaction wherein women have felt more comfortable stating what they really think and feel. Often, rather than asserting what they think at the appropriate moment, women say that what they think will please the listener. Later, they gossip, stating the moment their true thoughts. This division between a false self identified to please other and an authentic self need not exist when we cultivate positive self-esteem. The feminist movement really helped women understand the power that is gained through positive self-assertiveness. Gloria Steinem's bestseller, Revolution from Within, cautioned women about the danger of achieving success without doing the necessary groundwork for self-love and self-esteem. She found that achieving women who still suffered internalized self-hatred invariably acted out in ways that undermined their success. And if the self-hating successful person did not act out, she may have lived a life of private desperation, unable to tell anyone success does not. In fact, reverse crippled self-esteem. To complicate matters, women may feel the need to pretend that they are self-loving to assert confidence and power to the outside world, and as a consequence, they feel psychologically conflicted and disengaged from their true being, shamed by the feeling that they can never let anyone know who they really are. They may choose isolation, aloneness, for fear of being unmasked. This is true of men as well. When powerful men reach the height of personal achievement in their careers, they often undermine all they have worked for by engaging in self-destructive behavior. Men who reside at the bottom of our nation's economic totem pole do this, and so do men at the top. President Clinton engaged in deceitful behavior, betraying both his personal commitments to his family as well as his political commitment to be a paragon of American values to the people of this country. He did so when his popularity was at an all-time high, having spent much of his life achieving against the odds. His actions expose a fundamental flaw in his self-esteem. Although he was a white male, Ivy League educated, and economically well off, privileged, with all the accompanying perks, his irresponsible actions were a way of unmasking. Excuse me. I lost my page. His irresponsible actions were a way of unmasking, of showing the world that he was really not the, quote, the good guy he was pretending to be. He created the context for public shaming that no doubt mirrors moments of childhood shaming when some authority figures in his life made him feel he was worthless and that he would never be worthy no matter what he did. Anyone who suffers from low self-esteem can learn from his example. If we succeed without confronting and changing shaky foundations of low self-esteem rooted in contempt and hatred, we will falter along the way. That's a fact. I've seen, man, that's how they had to do that. That's why they had to do the whole 444 album. People kept making fun of Jay-Z for having a big nose, which in itself is racist. Always called this man a camel. I was like, I guess. I remember I would engage in those jokes, but that was part of my own self-hatred of my own blackness programming. It is no accident that lively purpose is the sixth element of self-esteem. According to Brandon, it entails taking responsibility for consciously creating goals, identifying the actions necessary to achieve them, making sure our behavior is in alignment with our goals, and paying attention to the outcome of our actions. And paying attention to the outcome of our actions so we see whether they are leading us where we want to go. Most people are concerned about living purposefully when it comes to choosing the work we do. Unfortunately, many workers feel they have very little freedom of choice when it comes to work. Most people do not grow up learning that work we choose to do will have a major impact on our capacity to be self-loving. Most of the people do not grow up learning that the work we choose to do will have a major impact on our capacity to be self-loving. Is that why I was drawn to retail? Because if you go to retail, you pretty much don't love yourself. Like, it's you were already crushed in your soul. That's interesting. Work occupies much of our time. Doing work we hate assaults our self-esteem and self-confidence. Yes, most workers cannot do the work they love. But we all can enhance our capacity to live purposefully by learning how to experience satisfaction in whatever work we do. We find that satisfaction by giving any job total commitment. When I had a teaching job, I hated the kind of job where you long to be sick so you have an excuse for not going to work. The only way I could ease the severity of my pain was to give my absolute best. I get that. This strategy enabled me to live purposefully. Doing a job, even though I did not enjoy what we are doing, means we leave it with a feeling of well-being. Our self-esteem intact. The self-esteem aids us when we go in search for a job that can be more fulfilling. Throughout my life, I have endeavored to not only do work I enjoy, but work with individuals I respect, like, or love. When I first declared my desire to work in loving environments, friends acted out. Friends acted as though I had truly lost my mind. Me right now. To them, love and work did not go together. But I was convinced that I would work better in a work environment shaped by an ethic of love. Today, as the Buddhist concept of right livelihood is far more widely understood, more people embrace the belief that work can enhance our spiritual well-being, strengthens our capacity to love, and when we work with love, we create a loving working environment. Whether I enter an office, I can immediately sense by the overall atmosphere and mood whether the workers like what they do. Marcia Centaur writes about this concept in her book, Do What You Love, The Money Will Follow, as a way to encourage readers to take the risk of choosing work that they care about and therefore learning through experience the meaning of right livelihood. I quit my last retail job literally a month before the entire world shut down. I was like, what is this? I started a podcast with my groups of friends called the Knowledge of Ignorance Podcast. I got 4 or 5 friends, and we bring on additional people often, trying to turn it into a platform for more positivity and cultural acceptance. Initially, I had no direction for the podcast, and it's only recently as I'm really stepping into myself, and I'm stepping into myself at a rapid pace. It's insane. As I'm stepping into myself, I'm realizing how I was just sputtering anger and hatred and sadness. And then I would also deflect to other people my own feelings of lack of success, my own feelings of lack of encouragement or lack of belief in me. Throughout the course of my life, I've been emasculated by a lot of people. Most people are trying to make me feel like, oh, your mother just treated you like shit. I'm just saying, no, she wasn't the only one. But I can't pretend like, I'm not going to pretend like that's the case. I've been emasculated by many people who, I don't know, I don't know what it is. A lot of people just say I look like my mama. Maybe that's the reason. Moral of the story is stepping into change and stepping into yourself when you don't know yourself, and especially when you're getting older, it's hit you like a goddamn train when you start to acknowledge who you are. Like, damn, I'm a lot of good qualities, but I'm also a lot of bad qualities too. Like I'm not possessive, but I'm neurotic. I thought I was more domineering, but I'm just paranoid. And my paranoia causes me to domineer. And I'm also stepping into my masculinity more, which is creating frictions in itself. Because for the most part, I was more in tune with my femininity most of my childhood. As soon as you're a straight man with femininity, they're going to say you're gay or they're going to call you a bitch. I never had the time to explain emotions to people. I'm like, I'm not your therapist. I'm only 8. We would be in junior high, not junior. Well, we'd be in the courtyard. I would just see so much. I'm like, why are we like this? Most of the boys are just trying to be athletes. All the girls are dancing up on the walls, and I'm just trying to be. Like, can I just be? Damn, I just want to be. And it got to that point, when you're the quiet kid, it could have been a good thing, but it could have been a bad thing. The quiet kid can easily turn into the kid who shows up at school. But if you nurture that kid from the get-go, have a good environment, you eliminate that altogether. I'm starting to see more and more and realize more and more that there aren't proper advocacy groups for children's rights overall, like, period. I don't know. Let's see what I can do with that. I'm nobody, but start a dialogue, I guess. Well, it's not even starting a dialogue. This dialogue has begun. It just needs to be expanded more. Because even, if you told me 4 years ago, children's rights, I would have been like, I ain't had no rights. What is that? But I'm realizing, like, that level of thinking is wrong. The other level of thinking that I'm realizing I dislike is any sense of, I don't know. I had a sense of condescension. I was very conceited because I knew internally that I've had a really huge propensity for goodness and for love and for truth. But those aren't always the things you need to make it in a place like New York City. While there are many meaningful insights, when I first declared my work to in a loving environment, friends acted as though I had truly lost my mind. While there are many meaningful insights in Centaur's book, it is equally true that we can do what we love and money will not always swallow. Although this is utterly disappointing, it can also offer us experimental awareness that doing what you love may be more important than making money. Sometimes has this been the case in my life. I've had work and a job that is less than enjoyable in order to have means to do the work I love. At one point in a very mixed job career, I worked as a cook in a club. Man, I hated working as a cook. I hated the noise and the smoke, but working nights left me free to write in the day, to do the work I truly wanted to do. I kept on saying I wanted to be a writer, and I never picked up a pen because I don't know. Every single time I made a book, or I wrote a song, or I made a video, or I wrote a short film, I destroyed it. Realize now because most of the work I was doing was reflective of myself. Oh, man. Whenever possible, it is best to seek work we love and to avoid work we hate. But sometimes we learn that we need to avoid by doing it. Individuals who are able to be economically self-sufficient doing what they love are blessed. Their experience serves as a beacon to us all, showing us the right way livelihood can strengthen self-love, ensuring peace and contentment in the lives we lead beyond work. Often, workers believe that if their home life is good, it does not matter if they feel dehumanized and exploited on the job. Many jobs undermine self-love because they require that workers constantly prove their worth. Individuals who are dissatisfied and miserable on the job bring this negative energy home. Clearly, much of the violence in domestic life, both physical and verbal abuse, is linked to job misery. We can encourage friends and loved ones to move towards greater self-love by supporting them in any effort to leave work that assaults their well-being. Folks who are out of the paid workforce, women and men who do unpaid work in the home, as well as other happily employed people, are often doing what they want to do. While they are not rewarded by an income, their day-to-day life often provides more satisfaction than it would if they worked at a high-paying job in a stressful and dehumanizing environment. Man, I remember every time I would quit a job, I would be made to feel like, why the hell did you quit that job? And it's hard to explain, like, I hate myself in this job. because this is a world ruled by money. So it's like, no matter what, well, if you don't got money, nigga. I'm like, well, I don't want the money. I don't want the money. And then people will bring up the argument, well, say that to someone who's broke. Nigga, I am broke. I don't want the money. I'm broke as shit and I don't want money. More than any of us, they have the freedom to develop right livelihood. Most of us do not learn when we were young that our capacity to be loving, self-loving, would be shaped by the work we do and whether that work enhances our well-being. No wonder what we have become as a nation. Most of us did not learn when we were young that our capacity to be self-loving would be shaped by the work we do and whether that work enhances our well-being. No wonder then that we have become a nation. So many workers feel bad. Jobs depress the spirit. Rather than enhancing self-esteem, work is perceived as a drag, a negative necessity. Bringing love into the work environment can create the necessary transformation that can make any job we do, no matter how menial, a place where workers can express the best of themselves. When we work with love, we renew the spirit. That renewal is an act of self-love. It nurtures our growth. It's not what you do, but how you do it. In the Knitting Sutra, Susan Linden describes the labor of knitting as a freely chosen craft that enhances her awareness of the value of right livelihood, sharing, quote, "What I found in this tiny domestic world of knitting is endless. It runs broader and deeper than anyone might imagine. It is infinite and seemingly inexhaustible in its capacity to inspire, excite, and provoke creative insight," unquote. Linden sees the world that we have traditionally thought of as woman's work as a place to discover godliness through the act of creating domestic bliss. A blissful household is one where love can flourish. Creating domestic bliss is especially useful for individuals living alone who are just learning to be self-loving. When we intentionally strive to make our homes places where we are ready to give and receive love, every object we place there enhances our well-being. I create themes for my different homes. My flat in the city has the theme, quote, "Love's meeting place." As a small town person moving to a big city, I found that I needed my environment to truly feel like a sanctuary. Since my one-bedroom flat is so much smaller than the places I have been accustomed to living in, I decided to take only objects I truly loved, the things I felt I could not do without. It is amazing how much stuff you can let go of. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of Persian. My country place has a desert theme. I call it Soledad Hermosa, beautiful solitude. I go there to be quiet and still, and to experience the divine, to be renewed. Damn, sis got houses, no doubt. Goals. Of all the chapters for this book, this was the one, of all the chapters for this book, this one was the most difficult to write. When I talked with friends and acquaintances about self-love, I was surprised to see how many of us feel troubled by the notion, as though their very idea implies too much narcissism or selfishness. We all need to rid ourselves of misguided notions about self-love. We need to stop fearfully equating it with self-centeredness and selfishness. Self-love is the foundation of our loving practice. Without it, our efforts of love fail. Giving ourselves love, we provide our inner being with the opportunity to have unconditional love we may have never longed to receive from someone else. Whenever we interact with others, the love we give and receive is always necessarily conditional. Although it is not impossible, it is very difficult and rare for us to be able to extend unconditional love to others. Rarely because we cannot exercise control over the behavior of someone else, and we cannot predict or utterly control our responses to their actions, We can, however, exercise control over our own actions. We can give ourselves the unconditional love that is grounding for sustained acceptance and affirmation. When we give this precious gift to ourselves, we are able to reach out of others from a place of fulfillment and not a place of lack. One of the best guides on how to be self-loving is to give ourselves the love we are often dreaming about receiving from others. There was a time when I felt lousy about my over 40 body. I saw myself as too fat, too this or too that. Yet I fantasized about finding a lover who would give me the gift of being loved as I am. It is silly, isn't it, that I would dream of being someone else offering me the acceptance and affirmation I was withholding from myself. This was a moment when the maxim, quote, "You can never love anybody if you are unable to love yourself," end quote, made clear sense. And I add, quote, "Do not expect to receive the love from someone else you do not give yourself," end quote. In an ideal world, we would all learn in childhood to love ourselves. We would grow, being secure in our worth and value, spreading love wherever we went, letting our light shine. If we did not learn self-love in our youth, there is still hope. The light of love is always in us, no matter how cold the flame. It is always present, making the spark to ignite, waiting for the spark to ignite, waiting for the heart to awaken and call us back to the first memory of being the life force inside a dark place, waiting to be born, waiting to see the light. Damn, Jay. Jesse Pascal. Chapter 5. Spirituality, Divine Love. As a woman and a lover, however, I am moved by the sight of my beloved. Where he is, I want to be. What he suffers, I want to share. Who he is, I want to be crucified for love. Living life in touch with divine spirits lets us see the light of love in all living beings. That light is a resurrecting life force. A culture that is dead to love can only be resurrected by spiritual awakening. On the surface, it appears that our nation has gone so far down the road of secular individualism, worshiping the twin gods of money and power, that there seems to be no place for spiritual life. Yet an overwhelming majority of Americans who express faith in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, or other religious traditions clearly believe that the spirit life is important. The crisis of American life does not seem to be generated by a lack of interest in spirituality. However, this interest is constantly co-opted by powerful forces of materialism, hedonistic consumerism. In the conclusion in his insightful work, The Art of Loving, written by mid-50s but still relevant today to today's world, psychoanalyst Erich Fromm courageously calls attention to the reality that, quote, the principle underlying capitalistic society and the principle of love are incompatible, end quote. He contends, quote, our society is run by a managerial bureaucracy, by professional politicians. People are motivated by mass suggestions. Their aim is providing more and consuming more as purpose in themselves. The cultural emphasis on endless consumption deflects attention from spiritual hunger. We are endlessly bombarded by messages telling us that our every need can be satisfied by material increase. Artist Barbara Kruger created a work proclaiming, quote, I shop, therefore I am, end quote, to show the way consumerism has taken over mass consciousness, making people think they are what they possess. While the zeal to possess intensifies, so does the sense of spiritual emptiness. Because we are spiritually empty, we try to fill up on consumerism. We may not have enough love, but we can always shop. Because we are spiritually empty, we try to fill up on consumerism. We may not have enough love, but we can always shop. Our national spiritual hunger springs from a keen awareness of emotional lack in our lives. It is response to lovelessness. Going to church or temple has not satisfied this hunger. Surfacing from deep within our souls, organized religion has failed to satisfy spiritual hunger because it has accommodated secular demands, interpreting spiritual life in the ways that uphold the value of a production-centered commodity culture. This is true of traditional Christian church, as it is a New Age spirituality. It is no accident that so many New Age spiritual teachers link their teachings to a metaphysics of daily life that extols the virtues of wealth, privilege, and power. For example, consider New Age logic, which suggests that the poor have chosen to be poor, have chosen their suffering. Such thinking removes all of us who are privileged the burden of accountability. Rather than calling us to embrace love in the greater community, it actually requires an investment in the logic of alienation and estrangement. The principle underlying capitalistic society and the principle of love are incompatible. He contends, quote, "Our society is run by managerial bureaucracy, by professional politicians. People are motivated by mass suggestion. Their aim is producing more and consuming more as purposes in themselves," end quote. The cultural emphasis on endless consumption deflects attention from spiritual hunger. Oh no. For example, consider New Age logic, which suggests the poor have been chosen to be poor, have chosen their suffering. Such thinking removes all of us from who are privileged the burden of accountability, rather than calling us to embrace love and greater community. It actually requires an investment in the logic of alienation. Damn. Rest in peace, man. So many people dying unnecessarily. It's disgusting. This basic interdependency of life is ignored so that separationists and individual gain can be defied. Religious fundamentalism is often represented as authentic spiritual practice. And given a level of mass media exposure that countercultural religious thought and practice never receive, usually fundamentalists, be they Christian, Muslim, or any faith, shape and interpret religious thought to make it conform and to legitimize a conservative status quo. Fundamentalist thinkers use religion to justify supporting imperialism, militarism, sexism, I said sexism twice, sexism, racism, homophobia. They deny the unifying messages of love that is at the heart of every major religious tradition. Yo, before I read this book, this is definitely a stance I've had before. Growing up, I grew up in a Christian household. My father was a Muslim, but he wasn't in my life. But I wanted to have a connection with him. So me being foolish, me definitely tried to be fake Muslim in my lifetime. But in the context of that, I learned different religions. And the best thing that I always had was my best friend Taj. When I would discuss religion with him, he had his faith in Christianity, and it was that faith that assured me that he was right to believe in it. Because I'm starting to think that there is no one religion for real, and a balanced life comes from finding balance with them all, maybe. I don't know, man. I'm still figuring this out. But I know one isn't the answer. Maybe it's 7. Usually fundamentalists, be they Christian, Muslim, or any faith, shape and interpret religious thoughts to make it conform and to legitimize a conservative status quo. Fundamentalist thinkers use religion to justify supporting imperialism, militarism, sexism, racism, homophobia. They deny the unifying messages of love that it is the heart of every major religious tradition. No wonder they make so many people claim to believe in religious teachings. No wonder goddamn dyslexia. No wonder then that so many people who claim to believe in religious teachings do not follow their habits, being to reflect those beliefs. The Christian church remains one of the most racially segregated institutions in our society. In Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter to American Christians, in which he assumes the persona of the biblical apostate Paul, he admonishes believers for supporting segregation. Quote, Americans, I urge you to be rid of every aspect of segregation. I should read it like Martin Luther King. Segregation is a blatant denial of unity, which we have in Christ. It substitutes an I-it relationships for the I-thou relationship, and regulates persons to the status of things. It scars soul and degrades the personality. It destroys community and makes brotherhood impossible. This is only one example of the way in which organized religious worship corrupts and violates religious principles about how we should live in the world and how we should act towards one another. Imagine how different our lives would be if all the individuals who claim to be Christians or claim to be religious were setting an example for everyone by being loving. Blatant misuses of spirituality and religious faith could lead us to despair about spiritual life if we were not simultaneously witnessing a genuine concern for spiritual awakening expressed counterculturally. What the fuck does that mean? Blatant misuses of spirituality and religious faith could lead us to despair about spiritual life if we were not simultaneously witnessing a genuine concern for spiritual awakening expressed counterculturally. Oh, I get that. Because people are waking up, it becomes much more easier to see the bull of church and state. Whether it is American Buddhists working in solidarity to free Tibet, or many Christian-based organizations that provide support in the way of food and shelter for needy globally, these embodiments of loving practice renew our hope and restore the soul. All around the world, liberation theology offers the exploited and oppressed a vision of spiritual freedom that is linked to struggles to end domination. A little more than 10 years after Fromm first published The Art of Loving, Martin Luther King Jr.'s collection of sermons, Strength to Love, was published. The major focus of these talks was the celebration of love as a spiritual force that unites and binds all of life. Like Fromm's earlier work, these essays champion spiritual life, critiquing capitalism, materialism, and the violence used to enforce exploitation and dehumanization. In a 1967 lecture opposing war, King declared, quote, When I speak of love, I am not speaking of any sentimental and weak response. I am speaking of the force which all great religions have seen as supreme unifying principle of life. Love is somehow the key that unlocks the door which leads to ultimate reality. This Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist belief about ultimate reality is beautifully summed up in the first episode of St. John. Let us love one another, for love is God, and everyone that loveth is born of God, and knoweth God. Throughout his life, King was a prophet of love. In the late 70s, when it was no longer cool to talk about spirituality, I found myself turning again and again to his work and to the work of Thomas Merton. As religious seekers and thinkers, both men focus attention on the practice of love as a mean of spiritual fulfillment. Extolling the transformative power of love in his essay, Love and Need, Merton writes, "Love is, in fact, an intensification of life, a completeness, a fullness, a wholeness of life. Life curves upward to peak of intensity, a high point of value and meaning, at which all its latent creative possibility go into the action and the person transcends himself or herself in encounter, response, and communion with another. It is for the first time that we came into the world, this communion and self-transcendence. We do not become fully human until we give ourselves to each other in love. The teachings about love offered by Fromm, King, and Merton differ from much of today's writing. There's always an emphasis in their work on love as an active force that could lead us into greater communion with the world. Much I enjoy Much as I enjoy New Age commentary on love, I am often struck by, we do not become fully human, no. A high point of value and meaning, at which all its latent creative possibility go into action. The person transcends himself or herself in encounter, response, and communion with another. It is for this that we came into the world, this communion and self-transcendence. We do not become fully human until we give ourselves to each other in love. The teachings about love offered from Fromm, King, and Merton differ from much of today's writing. There is always an emphasis in their work on love as an active force that should lead us to greater communion with the world. In their work, loving practice is not aimed at simply giving an individual greater life satisfaction. It is extolled at the primary way we end domination and oppression. It is important politicization of love. It is often absent from today's writing. Much as I enjoy popular New Age commentary on love, I am often struck by the dangerous narcissism fostered by spiritual rhetoric that pays so much attention to individual self-improvement and so little to the practice of love within the context of community. Packaged as a commodity, spirituality becomes no different from an exercise program. While it may leave the consumer feeling better about his or her life, its power to enhance our communion with ourselves and others in a sustained way is inhibited. Commenting on the value of an engaged life and the active life, the wisdom for work, creativity, and caring, Parker Palmer writes, "To be fully alive is to act. I understand actions to be any way that we can co-create reality with other beings and the spirit. Action, like a sacrament, is a visible form of an invisible spirit. An outward manifestation of inward power. But as we act, we not only express what is in us and help give shape to the world, we also receive what is outside of us and shape our inner selves. A commitment to a spiritual life requires us to do more than read a good book or go on A commitment to a spiritual life requires us to do more than read a good book or go on a retreat. It requires conscious practice, a willingness to unite the way we think with the way we act. Spiritual life is first and foremost about commitment to a way of thinking and behaving that honors principle of interbeing and interconnectedness. When I speak of spiritual, I refer to the recognition within everyone that there is a place of mystery in our lives where forces that are beyond human desire or will alter circumstances and or guide and direct us. I call these forces divine spirit. When we choose to lead a spiritual life, we recognize the celebration, the presence of transcendent spirits. Some people call this presence soul, God, and the beloved, higher consciousness, or higher power. Still, many say that this force is what is because it cannot be named. To them, it is simply the spirit moving in us and through us. A commitment to spiritual life necessarily means we embrace the internal principle that love is all, everything, our true destiny. Despite overwhelming pressure to conform to the culture of lovelessness, we still seek to know love. The seeking itself is a manifestation of divine spirit. Life-threatening nihilism abounds in contemporary culture, crossing the boundaries of race, class, gender, and nationality. At some point, it affects all our lives. Everyone I know is at times brought low by feelings of depression and despair about the state of the world. Whether it is an ongoing worldwide presence of violence expressed by the persistence of man-made war, hunger, and starvation, the day-to-day reality of violence, the presence of life-threatening disease that cause the unexpected deaths of friends, comrades, and loved ones, there is much that brings everyone to the brink of despair. Knowing love, or the hope of knowing love, is the anchor that keeps us from falling into the sea of despair. In a path with heart Jack Kornfield shares, the longing for love and the movement of love is underneath all our activities. Spirituality and spiritual life give us the strength to love. It is rare for individuals to choose a life in spirit, one that honors the sacred dimensions of everyday life, when they have no contact with traditional religious thought or practice. Spiritual teachers are important guides who provide a catalyst for a spiritual awakening. Another source of spiritual growth is communion and fellowship with like-minded souls. Spiritual seekers let their light shine so that others may see, not only to give service by example, but also to constantly remind themselves that spirituality is most gloriously embodied in our actions, our habits of being. Insightfully, Jack Kornfield explains, quote, "All other spiritual teachings are in vain if we cannot love. Even the most exalted states and the most exceptional spiritual accomplishments are unimportant if we cannot be happy in the most basic and ordinary ways. If, with our hearts, we cannot touch one another and the life we have been given, what matters is how we live." For many of us, church was the place where we first heard of the counter-narrative of love, one that differed from the confused messages about love learned in the dysfunctional families, the mystical dimensions of Christian faith, the belief that we are all one and love is all. Presented to me as a child in church were the space of redemption. At church, I learned not only to understand that God is love, I learned also that children were special in the heart and mind of Divine Spirit. Dreaming of becoming a writer, valuing the life of the mind above all things, it was especially awesome to learn my heart passages from the 1 Corinthians, the love chapter. From childhood on, I have often reflected on the passage that proclaims, quote, "If I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, if I deliver my body to be burned, but to have not love, I gain nothing." Quote. Throughout my graduate school years, as I worked hard to finish my doctorate, striving to maintain a commitment to spiritual life, in a world that did not value the spiritual, I learned to these lessons about the primacy of love. The wisdom they convey kept me from hardening my heart. Remaining open to love was crucial to my academic survival. I feel like I probably failed my college experience. I was definitely closed-hearted. I had a hard time receiving love. I was in a very negative environment, fostered by just toxicity. Again, perpetuated cycles. I'm tired of just being mad at people. I'm trying to look at bigger cycles of abuse and control, because he was a victim in itself, whether he knows it or not. Spiritual practice does not need to be connected or organized religion in order to be meaningful. Some individuals find their sacred connections to life, communing with the natural world and engaging in practices that honor life-sustaining ecosystems. We can mediate. Did you mean meditate? No, that says mediate. We can mediate, pray. Excuse me. We can mediate, pray, go to temple, church, mosque, or create a quiet sanctuary where we live to commune with Holy Spirits. To some folks, daily service to others is affirmative spiritual practice, one that expresses their love for others. When we make a commitment to stay in touch with divine forces that inform our inner and outer world, we are choosing to lead a life in the Spirit. I study spiritual teachings as a guide for reflection and action. Countercultural spiritual awakening is visible in books and magazines and in small circles where individuals come to celebrate and commune with the divine. Fellowship with other seekers after truth offers essential inspiration. Since the earliest roots of my spiritual practice were in the Christian tradition, I still find the traditional church to be a place for worship and fellowship. I also participate in the Buddhist practice. I meditate. No, this one is meditate. I meditate and pray. Everyone has to choose the spiritual practice that best enhances their life. This is why progressive seekers after truth urge us all to be tolerant, to remember that though our paths are many, we are made one community in love. The spiritual awakening that is slowly taking place counterculturally will become more of a daily norm as we willingly break mainstream cultural taboos that silence or erase our passion for spiritual practice. For a long time, many of my friends and work peers had no idea I was devoted to a spiritual practice. Among progressive thinkers and scholars, it would help more hip, cool, and acceptable to express aesthetic sentiments than to declare passionate devotion to divine spirit. I also did not want folks to think that if I talked about my spiritual beliefs, I was trying to convert them or to impose beliefs on them in any way. When we were growing up, my grandfather was a bishop. I never really believed in, I don't know, I always had questions. I never really believed in it all. Because everything about it was just contradictory in terms of, like, in the beginning there was darkness and then there was light. So that's the creation of love. But after that, God would just wrathful and wrathful and wrathful. I don't know, man. I don't know if that makes sense to me. Pure creation, you can't create anything purely without being full of love. Yeah. Something I'm learning myself. My belief that God is love and that love is everything. Our true destiny sustains me. I affirm these beliefs through daily meditation and prayer, through contemplation and service, through kindness, loving kindness, through worship and loving kindness. An introduction to loving kindness, Sharon Salzberg teaches that Buddha describes spiritual practice as the liberation of the heart, which is love. She urges us to remember that spiritual practice helps us to overcome the feeling of isolation, which uncovers the radiant, joyful heart within each of us and manifests this radiance to the world. Everyone needs to be in touch with the needs of their spirit. This connectedness calls to spiritual awakenings to love. In the biblical book of John, a passage reminds us that anyone who does not know love is still in death. All awakening to love is spiritual awakening. Living by a love ethic. We must live for the day and work for the day. When human society realigns itself with the radical love of God in a truly democratic paradigm, there is no love of power for power's sake. Awakening to love. Awakening to love can happen only as we let go of our obsession with power and domination. Yo, I am literally coming off of some shit like that. Like, when I started this podcast, I was just thinking about, all of the things we could do, all of the things we'd be able to grow. And it was like, Ted, who is even listening? Everyone got a podcast in 2021. Everyone started a podcast, yo. I was over here acting like, everyone was starting a podcast. Ted, what the hell you think you're doing? Man, living and learning, growing every day. Anyone who think you're gonna stop growing or changing, it's always about growing and changing for better. All spheres of American life: politics, religion, the workplace, domestic households, intimate relations, should and could have. Why am I reading like this? Awakening to love can happen only as we let go of our obsession with power and domination. Culturally, all spheres of American life: politics, religion, the workplace, domestic households, intimate relations, should and could have as their foundation a love ethic. The underlying values of a culture and its ethics shape and inform the way we speak and act. A love ethic presupposes that everyone has the right to be free, to live fully and well. We bring a love ethic to every dimension of our lives. Our societies would need to embrace change. At the end of The Art of Loving, Erich Fromm affirms that important and radical changes are necessary if love is to become a social and not highly individualistic marginal phenomenon. Individuals who choose love can and do alter our lives in ways that honor the primacy of a love ethic. We do this by choosing to work with individuals we admire and respect, by committing to give our all to relationships, by embracing a global vision wherein we see our lives and our fate as intimately connected to those of everyone else on this planet. Commitment to a love ethic transforms our lives of offering us a different set of values to live by. In a large and small ways, we make choices based on belief that honesty, openness, and personal integrity need to be expressed in public and private decisions. I choose to move to a small city so I could live in the same area as family, even though it was not as culturally desirable as the place I left. Friends of mine live at home with aging parents, caring for them even though they have enough money to go elsewhere. Living by a love ethic, we learn to value loyalty and a commitment to sustain bonds over material advancements. While careers and making money remains important agendas, they never take precedence over valuing and nurturing human life and well-being. I know no one who has embraced a love ethic whose life has not become joyous and more fulfilling. The widespread assumption that ethical behavior takes the fun out of life is false. In actuality, living ethically ensures that relationships in our lives, including encounters with strangers, nurture our spiritual growth. Behaving unethically with no thought of the consequences of our actions is like eating a ton of junk food. While it may taste good, in the end our body is never really adequately nourished and remains in a constant state of lack and longing. Our souls feel that this lack when we act unethically, behaving in ways that diminish our spirits and dehumanize others. Testimony in New Age writing affirms the way in which we embrace a love ethic transforms lives for the good. Yet a lot of this information only reaches those of us who have a class of privilege. And often, individuals who live lives are rich in spiritual and material well-being, who have diverse friends from all walks of life, who nurture their personal integrity. Tell the rest of the world these things are impossible to come by. I am talking here about the many prophets of doom who tell us that racism will never end, sexism is here to stay, the rich will never share their resources. We would all be surprised if they would enter their lives for a day. Much of what they are telling us cannot be had. They have. But in keeping with the capitalistic-based notion of well-being, they really believe there is not enough to go around, and that the good life can be had only by a few. Talking to a university audience recently, I expressed my faith in the power of white people to speak out against racism, challenging and changing prejudice, emphatically stating that I definitely believe we can all change our minds and our actions. I stress that this faith was not rooted in utopian longing, but rather that I believe this because of our nation's history of many individuals who have offered their lives in service of justice and freedom. When challenged by folks who claim that these individuals were exceptions, I agreed. But I talked about the necessity of changing our thinking so that we can see ourselves as being like the ones who does not change. So we can see ourselves as being like the one who does change, rather than among the among who refuse to change. I read that sentence horribly, and that was a good bar. When challenged by folks who claimed that these individuals were exceptions, I agreed. But I then talked about the necessity of changing our thinking so that we see ourselves as being like the one who does change, rather than among who refuse to change. What made these individuals exceptional was not that they were any smarter or kinder than their neighbors, but that they were willing to live the truth of their values. Here's another example. If you go door to door in our nation and talk to citizens about domestic violence, almost everyone will insist they do not support male violence against women, that they believe it to be morally and ethically wrong. However, if you then explain that we can only end male violence against women by challenging patriarchy, and that means no longer accepting the notion that men should have more rights and privilege than women because of biological difference, or that men should have the power to rule over women, that is when the agreement stops. Definitely, I noticed that. Yo, what's his name did a great joke. That damn Michael Shea. That joke was hilarious. The bravest nigga on the basketball team. That shit was hilarious, bro. There is a gap. There is a gap between the values they claim to hold and their willingness to do the work of connecting thought and action, theory and practice to realize these values and thus create a more just society. There is a gap between the values they claim to hold and their willingness to do the work of connecting thought and action, theory and practice to realize these values and thus create a more just society. Sadly, many of our own nation's citizens are proud to live in one of the most democratic countries in the world, even as they are afraid to stand up for individuals who live under repressive and fascist governments. They are afraid to act on what they believe because it would mean challenging the conservative status quo. Refusal to stand up for what you believe in weakens individual morality and ethics as well as those of the culture. No wonder then that we are a nation of people, the majority of whom across race, class, and gender, claim to be religious, claim to believe in the divine power of love, and yet collectively remain unable to embrace a love ethic and allow it to guide behavior, especially if doing so would mean supporting radical change. I'll probably finish this chapter and then I'll be done for the day. We face them by moving through fear. These changes are usually imposed by the status quo. For example, revolutionary new technologies have led us to accept computers. Our willingness to embrace this unknown shows that we are all capable of confronting fears of radical change, that we can cope. Obviously, it is not in the interest of the conservative status quo to encourage us to confront our collective fear of love, an overall cultural embrace. Nance? An overall cultural embrace of love ethic would mean that we would all oppose such a public policy conservatives condone and support. Society's collective fear of love must be faced if we are to lay claim to a love ethic that we can inspire us and give us the courage to make necessary changes. Writing about these changes that must be made, Fromm explains, quote, society must be organized in such a way that man's social loving nature is not separated from his social existence, but becomes one with it. If it is true, I have tried to show that love is the only sane and satisfactory response to the problem of human existence, then any society which excludes relatively the development of love must be in the long run perish of its own contradiction with the basic necessities of human nature. Indeed, to speak of love is not preaching, for the simple reason that it means to speak of the ultimate and real need in every human being. To have faith in the possibility of love as a social and not only exceptional individual phenomenon is an irrational faith based on the insight into the very nature of man. Faith enables us to move past fear. We can collectively regain our faith in the transformative power of love by cultivating courage and the strength to stand up for what we believe in and to accommodate and to be accountable both in the word and deed. I am especially fond of the biblical passage in the first epistle of John, which tells us, quote, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth our fear, because fear hath no torment. He feareth is not only perfect, he that feareth is not made perfect in love. From childhood on, this passage of scripture has enchanted me. But I'm getting tired. My dyslexia acting up. From childhood on, this passage of scripture has enchanted me. I was fascinated by the repeated use of the word perfect. For some time, I thought of this word only in relation to being without fault or defect. Taught to believe that this understanding of what it means to be perfect was always out of human reach. That we were, of necessity, essentially human because we were not perfect, but were always bound by the mystery of the body, by our limitations. This call to know a perfect love disturbed me. It seemed worthy calling, but impossible. That is, unless I look for a deeper, more complex understanding to the word perfect, and found the definition emphasizing the will to refine. Suddenly my passage was illuminated. Love as a process that has been refined, alchemically altered as it moves from state to state, is that perfect love that can cast out fear. As we love, fear necessarily leaves. Contrary to the notion that one must work to obtain perfection, this outcome does not have to be struggled for. It just happens. It is a gift perfect love offers. To receive the gift, we must first understand that there is no fear in love. But we do fear, and fear keeps us from trusting in love. Cultures of domination rely on the cultivation of fear as a way to ensure obedience. In our society, we make much of love and say little about fear. Yet we are all terribly afraid most of the time. As a culture, we are obsessed with the notion of safety. Yet we do not question why we live in states of extreme anxiety and dread. Fear is the primary force upholding structures of domination. It promotes the desire for separation, the desire to not be known. When we are taught that safety lies always the sameness, then difference of any kind will appear as a threat. When we choose to love, we choose to move against fear, against alienation and separation. The choice to love is a choice to connect, to find ourselves in another. Since so many of us are imprisoned by fear, we can move toward a love ethic only by the process of conversion. Philosopher Cornel West states that a politics of conversion restores our sense of hope. Calling attention to the pervasive nihilism in our society, he reminds us, nihilism is not overcome by arguments or analysis. It is tamed by love and care. Any disease of the soul must be conquered by a turning of one's soul. This turning is done throughout one's own affirmation of one's worth, an affirmation fueled by the concern of others. In an attempt to ward off life-threatening despair, more and more individuals are turning towards a love ethic. Signs that this conversion is taking place abound in our culture. It is reassuring when masses of people read literature like Thomas More, Care of the Soul, a work that invites us to reevaluate the values that undergird our lives and make choices that affirm our interconnectedness with others. I be forgetting I have this. It's my mama Bible. Original African Heritage Edition. King James Edition, whatever that means. We were collectively to demand that our mass media portray signs that this conversion is taking place abound in our culture is ensuring when masses of people read literature like Thomas More's Care of the Soul, a work that invites us to reevaluate the values that undergird our lives and make choices that affirm our interconnectedness with others. Embracing a love ethic means we utilize all dimensions of love: care, commitment, trust, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. In our everyday lives, we can successfully do this by cultivating awareness. Being aware enables us to critically examine our actions and see what is needed so that we can give care, be responsible, show respect, and indicate a willingness to learn. Understanding knowledge, just as an essential element of love, is vital because we are daily bombarded with messages that can tell us love is about a mystery, about which cannot be known. We see movies in which people are represented as beings in love who never talk with another, who fell in bed without ever discussing their bodies, their sexual needs, their likes, their dislikes. Indeed, the message received from the mass media is that knowledge makes love less compelling. That is the ignorance that gives love its erotic and transgressive edge. These messages are often brought to us by profiteering producers who have no clue about the art of loving, who substitute their mystified visions because they do not really know how to genuinely portray loving interaction. Those goddamn every kiss begin with K commercials piss me off. Is love if you giving jewelry? What? Love if you taking out a copay for a diamond ring? What? These commercials be wild and disrespectful and belligerent. And when Valentine's Day runs around, oh my gosh, they get so disrespectful. All the ways they try to sell love. Were we collectively to demand that our mass media portray images that reflect love's reality, it would happen. This change would radically alter our culture. This mass media dwells on and perpetuates an ethic of domination and violence because our image makers have more intimate knowledge of these realities than they have with the realities of love. We all know what violence looks like. All scholarship in the field of cultural studies focusing on critical analysis of the mass media, whether pro or con, indicates that images of violence, particularly those involve actions and gore, captures the attention of viewers more than still, peaceful images. The small groups of people who produce most of the images we see in this culture have heretofore shown no interest in learning how to represent images of love in ways that will capture, stir our cultural imagination, and hold our attention. If the work they did was informed by a love ethic, they would consider it important to think critically about the images they create, and they would mean thinking about the impact of these images, the ways they shape culture and inform how we think and act in everyday life. If unfamiliar with love's terrain, they would hire consultants who would provide the necessary insight. Even though some direct scholars try to tell us there is no direct connection between images of violence and the violence confronting us in our lives, the common sense truth remains. We are all affected by images we consume and by the state of mind we are in when watching them. If consumers wanted to be entertained and the images shown us as entertaining are images of violent dehumanization, it makes sense that these acts become more acceptable in our daily lives and that we become less likely to respond to them with moral outrage or concern. Were we all seeing more images of loving human interaction, it would undoubtedly have a positive impact on our lives. We cannot talk about changing the types of images offered us in mass media without acknowledging the extent at which the vast majority of the images we see are created from a patriarchal standpoint. These images will not change until the patriarchal thinking and perspectives change. Individual women and men who do not see themselves as victims of patriarchal power find it difficult to take it seriously, the need to challenge and change patriarchal thinking. But re-education is always possible. Masses of people are negatively affected by patriarchal institutions, and most specifically by male domination. Since individuals committed to advanced patriarchy are producing most of the images we see, they have an investment in providing us with representations that reflect their values, so that so many social institutions they wish to uphold. Patriarchy, like systems of domination, for example, racism, relies on socializations everyone to believe that in all human relations there is an inferior and a superiority party. One person is strong, the other is weak, and that is therefore natural for the powerful to rule over the powerless. To those who support patriarchal thinking, maintaining power in anyone is acceptable by whatever means. Naturally, anyone socialized to think this way would be more interested and stimulated by senses of domination and violence rather than by scenes of love and care. Yet they need a consumer audience to whom they can sell their product. Therein lies our power to demand change. While the contemporary feminist movement has done much to intervene with this kind of thinking, challenging and changing it, and by so doing, offering women and men a chance to lead more fulfilling lives, patriarchal thinking is still the norm for those in power. This does not mean we do not have the right to demand change. We have powers as consumers. We can exercise that power all the time by not choosing to invest time, energy, or funds to support the production and the dissemination of mass media images that do not reflect life-enhancing values and that undermine a love ethic. This is not meant to be an argument for censorship. Most of the evils in our world are not created by mass media. For example, clearly the mass media does not create violence in home. Domestic violence was widespread even when there was no television. But everyone knows that all forms of violence are glamorized and made to appear interesting and seductive by the mass media. The producer of these images, who could just as easily use the mass media to challenge and change violence. When images we see condone violence, whether they lead any of us to be more violent or not, they do affirm the notion that violence is an acceptable means of social control. That it is fine for one individual or group to dominate another individual or group. Domination cannot exist in any social situation where a love ethic prevails. Jung's insight that if the will to power is paramount, love will be lacking. Jung's insight that if the will to power is paramount, love will be lacking is important to remember. When love is present, the desire to dominate and exercise power cannot rule the day. All the great social movements for freedom and justice in our society have promoted a love ethic. Concern for the collective good of our nation, city, or neighbor rooted in the values of love makes us all seek to nurture and protect that good. If all public policy was created in the spirit of love, we would not have to worry about unemployment, homelessness, schools failing to teach children, or addiction. Were a love ethic informing all public policy in cities and towns, individuals would come together and map out programs that could affect the good of everyone. Melody Chavez's wonderful book, Altars in the Street, A Neighborhood Fights to Survive, tells a story of real people coming together across differences of race and class to improve their living environment. She speaks from the perspective of a white woman who moves with her family into a predominantly black community. As someone who embraces a love ethic, Moody joins her neighbors to create peace and love in their environment. Their work succeeds but is undermined by a failure of support from a public policy and city government. Concurrently, she also works to help prisoners on death row. Loving community in all its diversity, Melody states, "Sometimes I think that I've been trying on death row and in my neighborhood to gain some control over the violence in my life. As a child, I was completely helpless in the face of violence." Her book shows the changes of a love ethic that can make even in the most troubled community. It also documents the tragic consequences to human life when terror and violence become the accepted norm. When small communities organize their lives around a love ethic, every aspect of daily life can be affirming for everyone. In all his prose work, Kentucky poet Wendell Berry writes eloquently about the positive values that exist in rural communities that embrace a love ethic, an ethic of communalism and the share of resources. In another turn of the crank, Berry exposes the extent at which the interests of big business lead to the destruction of rural communities, reminding us that destruction is fast becoming the norm in all types of communities. He encourages us to learn from the lives of folks who live in communities governed by a spirit of love and communalism. Sharing some of the values held by citizens of these communities, he writes, "There are people who take a hold of a generous and neighborly view of self-preservation. They do not believe that they can survive and flourish by the rule of dog eat dog. And they do not believe that they can succeed by defeating or destroying or selling or using up everything but themselves. They doubt that good solutions can be produced by violence. They want to preserve the precious things of nature, of human culture, and pass them on to their children. They see no commonwealth or community of interest that can be defined by greed. They know that work ought to be necessary. It ought to be good. It ought to be satisfying and dignifying to people who do it, and genuinely useful and pleasing to people for whom it is done. I like living in small towns precisely because they are more often in the places in our nation where basic principles underlying a love ethic exist and are by standards by which most people try to live their lives. In the small town where I live, now only some of the time, there is a spirit of neighborlessness, of fellowship, care, and respect. These same values existed in the neighborhoods of the town in which I grew up. Even though I spent most of my time in New York City, I live in a cooperative apartment building where we all know each other. We protect and nurture our collective well-being. We strive to make home a place of positive environment for everyone. We all agree that integrity and care enhances all of our lives. We try to live by the principles of a love ethic. To live our lives based on the principle of love ethic, showing care, respect, knowledge, integrity, and the will to cooperate, we all have to be courageous. Learning how to face our fears is one way we embrace love. Our fear may not go away, but we will stand in the way. Those of us who have already chosen to embrace a love ethic, allowing it to govern and inform how we think and act, know that when we let our light shine, we draw to us and are drawn to other bearers of light. We are not alone. Chapter 7, Greed. The fading away of greed and hatred is the foundation for liberation. Liberation is the sure heart's release, an understanding of the truth, so powerful that there is no turning back from it. It's a short chapter. Although we live in close contact with neighbors, masses of people in our society feel alienated, cut off, alone. Isolation and loneliness are central causes of depression and despair. Yet they are the outcome of life in a culture where things matter more than people. Materialism creates a world of narcissism in which the focus of life is solely on acquisition and consumption. A culture of narcissism is not a place where love can flourish. The emergence of the me culture is a direct response of our nation's failure to truly actualize the vision of democracy articulated in our Constitution and Bill of Rights. Left alone in the me culture, we consume, and with no thought of others. Greed and exploitation become the norm when an ethic of domination prevails. They bring in their wake of alienation and lovelessness. Intense spiritual and emotional lack in our lives is the perfect breeding ground for material greed and overconsumption. In a world without passion, the passion to connect can be replaced by the passion to possess. While emotional needs are difficult and often are impossible to satisfy, material desires are easier to fulfill. Our nation fell into the trap of pathological narcissism in the wake of wars that brought economic bounty while undermining the vision of freedom and justice essential to sustaining democracy. Nowadays, we live in a world where poor teenagers are willing to maim and murder for a pair of tennis shoes or a designer coat. This is not a consequence of poverty. In dire situations of poverty, at earlier times in our nation's history, it would have been unthinkable to the poor to murder someone for a luxury item. While it was common for individuals to steal or attack someone in interest of acquiring resources, money, food, or something as simple as a winter coat to ward off the cold, there was no value system in place that makes a life less important than material desire for an essential object. Whether poor or rich, in the mid-50s, most citizens in our nation felt it was the best place in the world to live because it was a democracy, a place where human rights mattered. This sense of our nation's vision sustained its citizens and served as a catalyst empowering freedom struggles in our society. In the article, Chicken Little, Cassandra, and the Real Wolf, So Many Ways to Think About Future, Donella Meadows described the significance of a visionary standpoint. A vision articulates a future that someone deeply wants and does it so clearly and compellingly that it sums up the energy, agreement, sympathy, and political will, creativity, resources, or whatever it takes to make that vision happy. Our nation's active participation in global warfare called into question its commitment to democracy, both here at home and abroad. What visions was diminished in the wake of the Vietnam War, prior to the war, a hopeful vision of justice and love has been evoked by the civil rights struggle. the feminist movement, and sexual liberation. However, by the late 70s, after the failure of radical movements for social justice aimed at making the world a democratic, peaceful place where resources could be shared and meaningful life could become a possibility for everyone, folks must be stopped talking about love. The loss of lives at home and abroad had created economic plenty while leaving in its wake devastation and loss. Americans were asked to sacrifice the vision of freedom, love, and justice and put in its place the worship of materialism and money. This vision of society upheld the need for imperialistic war and injustice. A great feeling of despair gripped our nation when the leaders who led struggles for peace, justice, and love were assassinated. Psychologically, we were in despair even as economic booms opened up for jobs for women and men from previous disenfranchised groups. Instead of looking for injustice in the public world, individuals turned to their private lives, seeking a place of solace and escape. Initially, lots of folk turned inward to family and relationships to find a sense of connection and stability, coming face to face with rampant lovelessness. And the home created an overwhelming sense of cultural brokenheartedness. Not only did individuals despair about their capacity to change the world, they began to feel enormous despair about their ability to make basic positive changes in the emotional fabric of their daily lives. Divorce rates were primary indicators that marriage was not a safe haven, and mounting public awareness of the extent of which domestic violence and all manner of child abuse were widespread clearly revealed that the patriarchal family could not offer sanctuary. Confronted with a seemingly unimaginable emotional universe, some people embraced a new Protestant work ethic, convinced that a successful life would be measured by how much money one could be made and the goods one could buy with this money. The good life was no longer to be found in community and connection. It was to be found in accumulation and the fulfillment of hedonistic, materialistic desire. In keeping with this shift in values from a people-oriented to a thing-oriented society, the rich and famous, particularly movie stars and singers, began to be seen as the only relevant cultural icons. Why aren't there that many famous teachers? Make it make sense. Gone were the visionary political leaders and activists. Suddenly, it was no longer important to bring an ethical dimension to the work life. Making money was the goal, and by whatever means, widespread embrace of corruption undermined any chance that a love ethic would resurface and restore hope. I hate money. It's the root of all evil. By the late 70s, among privileged people, the worship of money was expressed by making corruption acceptable and the ostentatious parading of material luxury the norm. To many people, our nation's acceptance of corruption as the new order of the day, with the unprecedented exposure of presidential dishonesty and the lack of ethical and moral behavior at the White House, this lack of ethics was explained away by government officials linking support of big business to further imperialism with national security and dominance globally. This coincided neatly with the decline in influence of institutionalized religion, which had previously provided moral guidance. The church and temple became places where a materialistic ethic was supported and rationalized. Among the poor and other underclasses, the worship of money became more evident by the unprecedented increase in the street drug industry, one of the rare locations where capitalism worked for a few individuals. Quick money, often large amounts made from drug sales, allowed for the poor to satisfy the same material longings as the rich. While the desired objects might have differed, the satisfaction of acquisition and possession was the same. Greed was the order of the day. Mirroring dominant capitalistic culture, a few individuals in poor communities prospered while the vast majority suffered endless, unsatisfied cravings. Imagine a mother living in poverty who has always been taught her children the difference between right and wrong, who taught them to value being honest because she wants to provide them with a moral and ethical universe. who suddenly accepts a child selling drugs because it brings in home financial resources for both necessary and unnecessary expenses. Her ethical values are eroded by the intensity of longing and lack. But she no longer sees herself as living at odds with the consumer culture she lives in. She has become connected, one with the culture of consumption and driven by its demands. Love is not a topic she thinks about. Her life has been characterized by a lack of love. She found it makes life easier when she hardens her heart and turns her attention towards more attainable goals, acquiring shelter and food, making ends meet, and finding ways to satisfy desires for little material luxuries. Thinking about love may simply cause her pain. She and hordes of women like her have had enough pain. She may even turn to addiction to experience the pleasure of satisfaction she never found when seeking love. Widespread addiction in both poor and affluent communities is linked to our psychotic lust for material consumption. It keeps us unable to love, fixating on wants and needs, which consumerism encourages us to do. Promotes a psychological state of endless craving. This leads to an anguish of spirit and torment so intense that intoxicating substances provide release and relief while bringing in their wake the problems of addiction. Millions of our nation's citizens are addicted to alcohol and illegal drugs. In poor communities where addiction is the norm, where there is no culture of recovery, the poor who are addicted, who lack the means to indulge their habit, are caught in the grip of major physical emotional suffering. Addicts who want release from pain, they are not thinking about love. Of course, the ravages of addiction are more glaringly obvious in the lives of poor and disposed, because they have neither the means to engage in cover-up so effectively employed by privileged addicts, nor the access to recovery programs. When the case against O.J. Simpson was national news, there was little discussion of the role substance abuse played in facilitating the emotional estrangement in an already dysfunctional family.